territory of the Songhees Nation, Coast Salish. We're grateful to be here. And it's an unceded territory, so we also want to acknowledge the opportunity we have to be settlers in this location. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge as well Fern Perkins. She was really the big push. We didn't have very much time between the announcement of the grant and the deadline for the grant to get the funding for this project. The announcement was, I think, mid to the end of February, and the grant deadline was less than 7 weeks after that. So she was the one that really put on the push so that we can actually all be here, so that Norm can be here, and so that we can begin to bring Michif back into our community as a language that helps us to connect back with our ancestors and with, you know, the pieces of us that maybe we don't know as much about but are wanting to bring back. Thank you all for coming. Make sure, if you haven't, to sign the back sheet so we can prove to the government that everyone is a keen Michif learner, and that we can keep bringing Norm back over and over again. And thank you.
Okay, merci. Thank you. Bon matin. Norman, Fleury, and Dishnekashuk, and Michif Nia, and Michif Bishwa. I'm also very happy and honored to be here. I know that you've been trying hard to get me to come over here for a while now, and people have heard of the Michif language either through your own ancestry or just because you've kind of heard about it from your grandparents or your family or relatives. But a lot of people also have a lot of misconceptions about what Michif is. And what I've been teaching and what is my language is the heritage language of the Michif people. So sometimes there's also, it's a whole learning process where the Metis is a generic term for all of us politically, but in our own homes, we called ourselves Michifs, where I was born and raised in Manitoba, because we are the original people of the Red River. Like, I'm a 6th generation Michif. When I was a kid, I never heard that term Métis when I was a child. It wasn't there. It was half-breed. A lot of people were called half-breeds, and when the government, like the commissioners, when they were making all these transactions and in terms of land exchanges, like script, and if you look at history with John A. Macdonald, he called us half-breeds. You know, we originally half-breeds was the name, and some of the Métis communities, some places in the Red River, you have communities like St. James and St. Andrews, and those people were actually, they had their own language. They were of English, Scottish, and Cree and Soto ancestry. So their language was called Bungi. It was Gaelic, and it was English, it was Soto and Cree. And Bungi, actually in Soto, Bungis means a little bit. So it was a little bit of this language, a little bit of that to make a language. And that was the language of the, mostly in the, what they called themselves half-breeds, because, and their language was mainly English. So they were Protestant also, the majority, and they were actually Gaelic and English and Irish. And you know historically how the Protestants and Catholics never got along. And because they're French extraction, the Michifs and the half-breeds were of English and Irish, and they never got along in Europe either. And those problems always follow us wherever we go. Even today, the churches, there's problems if you're Protestant, and you know, like there was a lot of rivalries. I know my mother never wanted us. Well, my mom passed away 8 years ago. She was 108 years old. And she's from the old school. She was one of, you call those bona fide Michifs. Nothing interfered with her life. Not technology, nothing. She knew who she was. She was a Michif. And nothing came in the way because they were well armored, because they were happy and proud to be who they are. She wasn't involved in the assimilation process other than to keep in time with what was going on. She was born 1902, so she saw the first airplane, first trains. Like she was just about a third century person, you know, because she was 18, 19, and then 2000. So she's seen them, and she was able to adapt. Certain things she didn't want to use, like the microwave. She didn't like to use the remote control. She was afraid of it, so we had to have an old TV with the dial. And those kind of things. So there was certain things that she wanted to, she was able to do, capable of doing, but she was a person that resisted it. Resisted. She was, when you talk about resistance, that's power. You know, you don't always give in and fall for somebody doing something else. She had her own ways. She was her own person. And so she was the 5th generation Michif. Her parents were born 1879, 1880, so there they were in between that first resistance and the last resistance. So they were closely tied with their culture. They were prairie people. They were the buffalo people, the buffalo hunting people. And that's a powerful group but we can't forget that the Michifs of the Red River were also people that were little farmers, what you call little farmers, because they had their own lands when the government started to push them around, and that's how they started to resist. But our people were always tied to the land. They had a relationship with the land. They had a relationship with, and they had their own distinct culture. That's why sometimes it's really tough when somebody from way down east, his mother is First Nation and the dad is another nationality and they're Metis. Well, it took us generations to become Michifs. That's why we're distinct people. We have our language, Michif, and the other group have their language, Bungis. And then we have our own history, we have our own stories, we have our legends, our mythology, we have our music. All of that we made for ourselves as special groups. Like people said half-breed. I'm not a half-breed, I'm double. Never mind half, you know. It takes 2 people to make one, that's double. You know? So that's who I am, you know what I mean? But I was very, very fortunate, and I really thank God, our Creator, for being that special person in a special time. And where a lot of unfortunate people didn't have that same thing. Through whatever, like residential schools or the 60s school or the adoptions and people that were not as fortunate. And then, yes, there's been a lot of problems in terms of assimilation and colonization. Well, we are colonized in certain ways, but I'm not colonized. I still have my language. I still know who I am. But we had to assimilate in order, as we've evolved to where we are here in Victoria. You know, like you live like the Victorians, or you live like the way people live here. So you, from eating buffalo, you start eating salmon, and you start to fish. And there's people from back home that went and moved to Kitimat and Terrace. And so they have a different culture, but when they come back home to St. Lazare, Manitoba, not far from Winnipeg, about 3.5 hours west, they go hunt deer, and they go and hunt that rabbit, and they make their soup, the rababu, and they connect with the land there, their spiritual connection to the land. They connect to that because their grandparents lived that life. So, but with language itself, language is actually culture. You can't separate both. You know, like you got culture, you have language, you have language, you have culture. Because within the language, you have your stories and your history and your mythology, and you have all those connections as who you are. So when we were children, like we were an oral cultured people. We were never a written cultured people. Because my grandparents, if they went to school, my grandma never ever went to school, and that's my maternal side. And she never wanted to go to school. Because she said to cut posts and to hunt and fish, you don't have to go to school for that. Because they had their own schooling. So you can't always qualify who you are from academics. You know, those people were never they were an oral cultured people. They were also people that some of them were connected to to the school if they lived close to like St. Laurent, Manitoba, or Saint-François-Xavier. There were some schools, but they were all French-controlled schools. Like John Fleury, that's my grandmother's uncle, he was a secretary for Louis Riel. And he wrote in French. And my grandma used to say, le bon français, good French, you know. They would say the good French. So there was those that spoke, the Michif people that spoke French, that are Michifs in St. Laurent, Manitoba, and different parts of Manitoba. In Batoche, they say they speak Michif, le français de Michif. Okay? So it's the French that the Michif speak. Like Louis Riel was a French speaker. Louis Riel and his, La Gemaudière and the Knoll and all those people from around Saint-Vital and Saint-Norbert, and my grandfather on my dad's side, Vermat, he was from Saint-Norbert. They were French Michif-speaking people. So they would say, ah ben, comment ça va? Bonjour, ça fait longtemps que je t'ai pas vu, c'était une belle journée aujourd'hui. But that's Michif way of talking French. But French would say, ah bonjour, ça fait longtemps que je t'ai pas vu, comment ça va? That's a difference, you see. So that's the difference. The Michif had their own way of speaking French, and they had their own expressions also. You know, they had their own, and they mixed a little. They might, those people that speak, they're Michifs that speak le français des Michif, they might have a few words, few Cree or Soto words, like panachan, which is a little bird that has no feathers. That's a panachan. And shikak, that's a skunk. So they'll use those, a few words. We think that sometimes some of the people that were in, a lot of our people were in denial also. They didn't want to be Métis, like, because they felt if you're visibly, a little visibly more French, but the Métis look like what we look here. You can look anything when you're a Métis because you're the best of both worlds. You can look like me, or I can look like you. And I have nephews and nieces that actually have a harder time because they're fair and blue-eyed and blonde. They have a tough time. They're discriminated by our own people. When they go for membership, say, no, you can't be a Métis. Well, that's racism. You know, like, that actually is lateral violence. Like, I mean, they assume because that person looks like that, they're not Métis. You know, like, I know I've had nephews and nieces that phone me from, you notice I say phone me, call me or telephone, or and they'll say, Uncle, you know, I have a problem. They won't, that was in Ontario, they won't accept that I'm a Métis because I'm fair. You know, like, well, that's, she's fair, but that's unfair. So we go through a whole process in life where this is why the registry is so important. People are talking about a national registry, and that registry will say that you are that Métis, since now that's the generic term is Métis. So if you meet that and you qualify, you're the Métis person, because there's so many people now that that want to be a Métis for whatever reason, but they don't know how. Like, I remember there used to be Ed Swain that was in BC. He worked with the MNBC, and a person says, "Well, my daughter is West Coast and Philippine. Is she Métis?" And he said, Our Red River carts are too full in our canoe. Sorry, can't accept you right now. But there's a lot of people, and you know what? It's all about teaching and learning, because those are, people have misconceptions about a lot of things, you know? And people, if you eat bannock, that means you're a Métis. No, a lot of people eat bannock, you know? That doesn't qualify you as being Métis because you eat rabbit or bannock. I mean, there's different ways, and even fried bannock, li bang we call them, okay? There's different people that make li bang, and li bang in French, and bang is a donut. And because we got that Michif, our language, li bang, our nouns and associated grammars in French, and our verbs and associated grammars in Cree, that's the makeup of the Michif language, okay? And the linguists, like Peter Bacher, especially a linguist that he teaches in Aarhus in Denmark, but he was a young Dutchman from the Netherlands, and he wanted to know about our language. He was totally flabbergasted that there was a language that belonged to a people that was born with a people, with two family languages that made one language. Couldn't believe how that came to be. And so it looked like the duck-billed platypus, you know, it had so many parts to it. And he said, how can that be? So I recognize this Peter Bacher because he came to Canada. He lived in Metis communities around Prince Albert and Duck Lake and Duck Bay and Camperville and St. Lazare, and he lived with the Michifs, and in La Brette also. He wanted to learn how this language, the makeup, but when he came to us, he sort of made us realize that our language was in danger. It was an endangered species. You hate to call it a species, but it was endangered because it was not in schools, it wasn't part of the curriculum. It was a language that was a family language, an oral language, but never was in the larger community other than in the Michif communities. And that's because the reason the Michif language was strong in the communities, the Michif taught Michif language to each other, the Michifs in the community. But when they went out someplace, they spoke that language of that community. That's why the Michifs, like myself, I speak 7 languages, but my dad and all those other people back home, they could talk Soto. Because when you live close to a community like a Soto, you were able to speak Soto. But they couldn't speak our language, but we were able to speak their language. The Crees, we spoke their language, but they couldn't speak our language. The French, we spoke their language, they couldn't speak our language. And the English, they never tried. They always wanted to be predominant, and it was the language. A lot of the problems with assimilation came through the English, you know, a lot of the times. But in some French communities, like St. Lazare, Manitoba, where I was born and raised, it's 100% French immersion. So now they would like to know a bit about Michif, because they know that was the ancestral language of those communities. And that's very important. So our ancestors, the Michifs, had a language. And those other people that had Bungi also, and people want to reconnect with that. But I think it's been, probably 80, 90 years ago probably that Bungi has been spoken, where Michif is still alive, but it's not well. We have to make it well. So this is how we have to connect. But we've come a long, long ways. I've been working on the Michif language now for quite a few years. So now we have, in the Michif language, we have writing evidence, and we have also resources like CDs, and we're building more and more resources. And we have 2 main institutions, but the Gabriel Dumont Institute in Saskatoon, I've done a lot of work with them. I've interviewed elders in Michif, and we're transcribing those stories into English because they're very, very important. Like when the older people, like my grandma and my grandparents, when they talked about their stories, it was Kayash. That's a long time ago, Kayash. Okay? Anush is today. Demain is tomorrow. So we have to connect with Kayash, Anush, and try to build a Demain, okay, tomorrow. For our children and those the unborn also. The unborn, like I'll have a grandchild born in December. When that little girl, because we know the gender now, is going to, what is there for that little girl in the Métis world? What is there? What can that little girl hang on to survive? No. If we leave nothing for that little girl and those other little girls and little boys, it'll be sad, you know. It'll be a sad day when we say we're Métis and we have an economic base and we have all these, but we don't have a cultural and linguistic base. Because my grandma and grandfather, and they said, when we lose our language, it'll be pitiful in our culture. It'll be sad, you know. So we don't want that to happen. That's why I'm here with you. So we can, you know, as long as you're able to say Tan Shikiya Nosh, how are you today? You're speaking your ancestral language and it's alive. But if you always say, how are you? It's a nice day and it's going to snow in English. 98% of people say that. But if you're that 1 or 2% of Michif, it'll be very powerful. That'll be 2% that we don't have or didn't have. So that's what is the strength of the empowerment. When you're talking about empowering ourselves, when you talk about healing, you talk about reconciliation. There's truth in reconciliation. The truth has to be told in order to reconcile. That's the problem, you know. You see a lot of things on the media loves to grab things. You know, and sometimes they have their own version, but they don't have a vision. You know? You have to have a vision to be a visionary. You have to say, well, when I'm gone, I'm going to be happy when I'm going to leave this world because I'm leaving a legacy. I've tried my best, you know. And then when you're ready to leave this world, then you could say, I left something behind. Like when my mom at 108, she said, I'm tired and I want to go home. And she said, where I'm going is beautiful. My parents are coming for me. So I'm not afraid to die because I know I'm going to go where my mom is and it's going to be it's beautiful. You know? So if you have those teachings, then you know those are powerful teachings. And that's what our grandparents had. They had those powerful teachings. Spiritually, they were connected. And that's all part of language. You know, I pray hard. You know, they prayed hard. And prayer to a lot of people, some people are, when they don't understand what prayer means, you know, they don't know what that means. Basically what it is, it's a personal connection with the greater power. That's basically what it is. You're building your own connection with the greater power. It's that personal relationship. It's like a personal relationship you have with your mom and dad, your brothers, your sisters. You can say something to your sister and brother that I can't, because you have that personal relationship. So it was the same thing in our home. I seen my mom and her sisters, they could cry together. There were 6 sisters and they had a brother. And they could cry and laugh and it was okay, you know, it was natural. If somebody had a problem, you hugged them or you said, Kiam, never mind, it'll be better, you know, or they'd hug. That's part of our culture, is that hugging and cherishing and loving one another as a family. The family was so important, because when my grandfather left St. Laurent, Manitoba in the late 1800s, that's just a little after the first resistance, and they were leaving to go to free land and freer home and freer life and not to be disrupted. So they left St. Laurent with, I think he said about 3, like you'd have wagon trains. So they had chickens and they had their cattle and they had their dogs and they were with their horses and a lot of people there was wagon trains. Sometimes they followed the old trails like the Carleton Trail that went right across what we know as Canada. But in those days when they left, there was a Manitoba, but there were no prairie provinces. Saskatchewan was the Northwest Territories. Alberta was the Northwest Territories. And out here was unknown, you know. Lewis and Clark did what they could do, but not the Métis. Some Métis came over here to the mountains. They weren't mountain people, but they came, most of the people that left home in St. Lazare was in the late 40s, early 50s to go looking for work. And they came to around Vancouver. They went to work in peat moss farms. Some of them went to Kitimat. They went out there to do logging because they were loggers. and some people went to Kamloops and different places. And they established themselves because our people are people that will adapt quickly. Our Métis people were very much survivors. They could adapt anywhere. You'll never make a Métis stuck. The old terminology at home, half-breed never gets stuck. That was the old term. Our people, wherever they went, and that's, like I have a cousin that left home. My grandparents raised him and another cousin of mine. My grandparents, like that extended family unit, if your parents were working or your parents passed away, the parents took over those children, their grandchildren. That's why we had no welfare system. That's why we didn't have child and family services. Because we had that extended family unit as a nation, as a people. And when I had my godparents, mo parents, mama, and like, if my parents passed away, your godparents, they take that vow to raise you as a baby when your parents are gone. You see, that's what they used to follow, those old ways. And then all of a sudden we start losing it because we thought we'd live better if we've adapted and leave our own culture. Now we're trying to retrieve our culture, you know, because we know that there's some elements missing in our life. And once we start to reconnect with language and culture, and if you understand what that Red River Jig is, and those special songs, they had table songs. Years ago, the Michifs used to sing songs for Christmas, and they'd sing songs at New Year's. New Year's was one of the biggest celebration of the Michif people, the Métis. You would celebrate from January 1st to the 6th, which was All Kings Day. And All Kings Day was the giveaway day. That's when you met somebody someplace, you're going with the horses. I talk about a long time ago, Payash. And if I met you on the road, if I had something, maybe pets, I'd give them to you and you gave me something. That was the exchanging of gifts. That was that giveaway day. That's the, I forget what they used to call it, Shakschenito and shaking hand day. And that's when you gave something to somebody. You weren't forced to do it. But if you had a little pocket knife or you had something that was, maybe that person would look and they'd look and say, oh, I see a nice pen. And give me that pen, you know. Or your eyes would connect with something that person, oh, it looks like they like that, so I can take that off. And they give away coats, give away vests, they give away a lot of things. So that was the culture. We were a people that that actually, we were givers, not takers, you know what I mean? Like my mother, when she passed away, she didn't have anything because she gave it away while she was alive, you know? And to have a trunk full of things and that person is gone, what do you know to give away, you know? She knew what to give away, so she said, take that. Give it to Dad. Take it home. So, like the jam that I got this morning, I think, because, you know, the tobacco is okay, but this is actually, you know, because it was given to me, it's okay, but this is more First Nations than it is Métis. Okay? Because when you came to my place, and my mom was killing chickens, butchering chickens, she would give you a chicken. That was how we gave away. If she was making bread, she'd give you a loaf of bread. See, that's how, because some Métis followed it, some, very few. Like I know this one lady at home, she had, like today people are connecting with the First Nations way. But the majority of people, like you'll hear that today. That's not us, that's not ours. You know, you'll hear that today. And that makes sense. Like my sister that's 93 years old, she would say, well, I'm not an Indian, you know. And that's the term they still use, and it's not racist term, because First Nations still use that term Indian, you know. It's Indian Act, it's Indian Affairs, you know. But I prefer to use Sioux, Dakota, or Soto, or I'm talking about the Prairie Plains people, because I don't know the nations here, but you know, and I hate to say it because it'd be disrespectful, but I respect the territory we're in. And that's just relatively new that we're acknowledging that. You know, like in Saskatoon, you're on Treaty 6 and the homeland of the Metis. That's the land that you acknowledge. So when my mom would be making jam, and if you came, she'd give you some jam, you know. That was our sharing. That's how, because the old people smoked their own tobacco, but it wasn't ceremonial. My grandfather used to smoke a nicky-nick. That's that red willow. You take that outer bark and the inner bark. That's the dermis and the epidermis, and then you had the wood after. So you had to go in between to get that tobacco. And you shave that off, because you didn't want wood, because it would burn when you're smoking it. And then he would dry that in the oven, and those were pie plates. The tabac, they call that the tabac, tobacco. But then he'd take it and he'd roll it to make it soft, like in his hand, crumble. And then he'd have Ogden tobacco, like some of those old nice tobaccos from the store, if he was able to afford that. Then he'd mix it up together. And he'd have a leather pouch for his tobacco. Then I remember he'd dip his pipe in there and he'd pack it up. He got so used to smoking pipe, sometimes he'd look for his pipe and it was in his mouth. Tandem ma pipe, where's my pipe? Dans ta bouche, ça mon vieux. My grandma used to tell me, in your mouth, you crazy old fool. It's because he didn't have the feelings like he was there for so long. It just hangs this way. To him, it was the feeling of that. You know, it was there for so long. Tandem a pip. And my grandma's nickname was Tachin. They had nicknames, Tachin. She said, Data Bush Jean-Baptiste, his name was Jean-Baptiste. There were a lot of Jean-Baptistes in those days, and there was a lot of Paul, and there was a lot of Philippe, and there were all those old French Michifs, the names of the old Michifs. So this is why when you look at the names of the Michifs, they're different than the people that were of English and Irish and Scottish and First Nations. Their names were different again. So that's how you connect it. But if the Michifs, my auntie was the first one to marry an English person, one of my aunties, Della, they called her after. And her kids now, because they were Michif, and the dad was Anglais, so they were Michif Anglais. Okay? My grandma would say, Michif Anglais. Okay? And if they married French, they were Michif Canadien. They were not Michif Français. They were les Canadiens. Okay? That's Canadian, Canadien, but it was their own pronunciation. Or the Michif Écossais for Scottish. The Michif Chinois, because we have people that married, my niece married a Chinois, you know. And those kids and my mom, you know, the old people. And even now we're related to Chinese, she said. And because it was totally unusual, you know, like you never connected. And I remember my mother saying, after people are starting to ask about who we are as Métis or Michif, and she said, well, it's like making a soup, she said. You put a bone in there, and you put some carrots, and you put turnip, and you put potatoes, stir it up, take it out, that's a Métis. You know? So she was just laughing, because we're a mixture. You know? But that mixture we had, what people would say, I'm Michif, or I'm a half-breed, and today people are Métis. But if you simplify things too much, and say we're all the same, that's where the problem comes in. You have to have a difference. You have to have your culture and say, well, who was your grandma and grandpa? And where did they come from? What did they speak? You know, were they involved? Were their ancestors involved with the resistances, which we used to call the rebellion? And when I went to school, I didn't want to go to school that day because they talked about Riel as a traitor and a mental case. And now we've changed. We have a Riel Day, a Louis Riel Day. You know, we've come a long ways. We have Family Day. Riel is also seen as a different person because of his contributions, you know. And Riel had that chance to say, yeah, I'm crazy, I'm mental, and he could have been free, but no. He chose to say, I'm giving my life because I'm fighting for something, and I'm showcasing what I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for land and language, and I'm fighting for who we are as a people. Les droits, my grandfather used to say, those are rights. Les droits, le terrain, the land, you know. La langue, our language, those kind of things. Those were important things that they fought for. And there were resistances because people were in those days very, very powerful people, because they had that land base, they had their culture, they had all those things that made you who you are as a people. So you weren't just somebody that was living just anywhere at all and you were just anybody. That's what people, we were excluded from government. We were excluded by a lot of people because they said, oh, they're nothing but half-breeds, they're nobody. You know? I've heard First Nations people and others say, oh, you guys have a language because of us. You guys got a culture because of us. You know, like, you get all those controversies. No, that's not because of you. It's because of me. We developed ourselves as a people. And that's why this evidence that we're here in Victoria today, and we know who we are, and we know what we want, and we're here to get what we like. You know, those are the kind of things that people get to see one another and learning your language. You know, like, so we're going to learn things like, how are you this morning? We'll learn things like niceties, and we'll learn about a little bit about the weather. We'll learn about greetings. Like, when you look at learning your language, it's no different you wanting to learn a different language. It's the same thing, other than this is your language. You know, that's the difference. If you're going to learn a language, like we're speaking, I've been speaking